The fourth version is the one Nadia keeps coming back to. Not because it's the most devastating thing she's ever been told. It is. But that's not why it stays. It stays because it fits. Every silence she'd smoothed over. Everything she'd noticed and then gently set aside. Every moment she'd chosen the easier explanation because the other one was a door she wasn't ready to open. The fourth version locks all of it together. And once something fits like that, you can't unfasten it. Nadia is 34. She met Graham at a mutual friend's going-away dinner. The kind where nobody's really there for the person leaving, everyone's just glad for the excuse to gather. He was funny without effort, relaxed in that particular way that reads as confidence when you're 29, and reads as something more complicated once you've lived a little longer and understand what genuine ease actually costs a person. She didn't analyze it at the time. She just liked him. They move in together at the 18-month mark, get a dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Biscuit. Start having the real conversations, the ones about what comes next, what they want, what they're building. Carefully at first, then openly, the way you do when you've decided someone is safe. By year 3, Nadia is pregnant. She loses the baby at 11 weeks. It doesn't happen the way grief is supposed to announce itself. A scan, a quiet room, a doctor choosing words the way you'd lower something fragile onto a glass shelf. Graham isn't there. A client pitch has been pushed back. There's pressure. And Nadia had told him to stay because she genuinely believed it would be nothing. She is wrong. She sits in that room alone, and then she drives herself home. And then she watches the front door and waits. He comes in at 9:47. She knows because she'd been watching the clock do its slow work. She tells him in the hallway. He holds her for a long time without speaking. He says all the right things when he does. And Nadia, who is already wrung out in a way that goes somewhere beneath the physical, lets herself be held and doesn't ask questions. That's version 1. Working late. A difficult client. No choice. She has no reason to disbelieve it, so she doesn't. The second version surfaces 8 weeks later. Not because Graham offers it, but because Nadia mentions that night at a dinner party. His colleague Marcus is there. She brings it up sideways, the way grief tends to arrive when you've stopped guarding against it. Marcus goes briefly, carefully still before saying, slowly selecting each word, that he'd thought Graham had left the office early that afternoon. She brings it up when they get home. Graham doesn't miss a beat. Traffic. Standstill on the motorway. His phone had died, and he hadn't wanted to call from a stranger's mobile and frighten her. He'd meant to mention it. It just hadn't felt like the right moment. Plausible. She accepts it. Files it somewhere she doesn't quite look at. The third version comes in January. They're arguing. Not about this. About something smaller and louder and easier to sustain. And in the middle of it, Graham says, almost involuntarily, that he'd been at a work event that night. A client dinner, already booked, that he'd felt terrible about attending. He'd stayed because canceling would have cost them the account. He'd wanted to tell her, but the timing had never been right. She stops arguing. She looks at him. He looks back. And for just a half second, not long, barely a breath, she watches him recalibrate behind his eyes. People who are telling the truth don't do that. They don't recalibrate. They get flustered, or they get loud, or they go quiet with a specific weight of being misunderstood. They don't pause and silently select the next version. Nadia knows this. She has always known things like this. She just hadn't been applying what she knows to Graham. That's the thing about loving someone. The pattern is right there. You just keep deciding not to read it. She doesn't leave that night. But something shifts. Quietly, the way the most important things always do. And she starts paying a different kind of attention. The attention Nadia starts paying isn't dramatic. That's the part nobody tells you. It doesn't look like detective work. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. She still makes dinner, still laughs at the right moments, still reaches for his hand in the cinema and lets him pull her close on Sunday mornings when Biscuit launches himself onto the bed and the whole thing dissolves into noise. She is present. She is warm. She is also, now, watching. What she's watching for, she couldn't fully say. She just knows that something in her has quietly stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. And she needs to understand why before she does anything with that information. So she pays attention, the way you do when you've realized a noise in the house isn't the pipe settling. Careful, unhurried, tracking. Graham, to his credit, doesn't change much. That's the thing about people who are practiced at managing a version of events. They don't panic. They don't overcorrect. They keep the performance at the same pitch it's always been at, which is actually a performance in itself, if you know what you're looking for. Nadia is starting to know. She notices that he has 3 categories of phone behavior. There is the phone on the table, face up, not important. There is the phone in the pocket, also not important. And then there is the phone held at a specific angle, screen tilted just slightly away from her eyeline, which she has been clocking for longer than she wants to admit, without ever consciously naming it. She names it now. She notices that his stories about work have a quality to them. Not lies exactly, nothing she can grab hold of, but a kind of pre-shaped smoothness, like they've been considered before delivery. Real stories have texture. They bump up against themselves. They have the kind of unimportant detail you'd only include because it's just how it happened. Graham's stories are clean, efficient. She used to think this was a personality trait. The engineer's brain, she'd called it once, affectionately. Now she's not sure. She notices that Marcus, at the dinner party, had looked away first. If you've ever loved someone who turned out to be a different person than you thought, stay with us. Because what happens next is the part that changes how Nadia sees everything. Hit subscribe so you don't lose this one. The 4th version of that night isn't something Graham tells her voluntarily. It comes out of a phone. Specifically, it comes out of Graham's phone, which he leaves on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday afternoon in February while he's in the shower, and which buzzes twice with a name Nadia doesn't recognize. She doesn't pick it up. She wants to be clear about that, even now when it barely matters. She doesn't pick it up because she goes looking. She picks it up because she's standing right there and the name, Simone, is already visible on the locked screen above a preview that reads, "I keep thinking about that night you." The screen goes dark before she gets the rest. She sets the phone back down exactly where it was. She stands in the kitchen. She listens to the shower running, and she waits for him to come back. He comes back towel-dried and easy, the way he always does. Picks up the phone without looking at it, makes himself a coffee, says something about the weather in the particular absent way that means he's thinking about work. She asks, very calmly, who Simone is. The pause that follows is not long. A beat, maybe 2. But Nadia has been paying attention for 3 months now, and she knows exactly what a pause that shape means. A colleague, he says, from the Edinburgh office. They worked on a pitch together last year. She nods. She doesn't push. She goes back to what she was doing. But she's already done the arithmetic. The Edinburgh pitch, she knows, because she was at his company dinner when he was celebrated for it, was finalized in October. The same month she lost the baby. The same night he came home at 9:47, smelling like himself and saying all the right things and holding her until she stopped shaking. The 4th version of where Graham was that night isn't working late. It isn't traffic, and it isn't a client dinner. The The fourth version has a name. And Nadia has been watching long enough now to understand that Simone isn't a new development. She's a pattern. The question isn't what Graham did. Not anymore. The question is how long he believed she'd never put it together. Here's what Nadia doesn't do. She doesn't confront him that night. She doesn't go through his phone. She doesn't call her best friend and pour it all out over wine and let the shape of it harden into something she can't take back. She has spent 3 months learning to be still. And she is still now, even though everything in her wants to move. What she does instead is think. She thinks about the version of herself who sat alone in that quiet room at 11 weeks and held her own hand and drove herself home and didn't ask where he'd really been because she loved him. And love, she understood then, meant extending the kind of trust that leaves you exposed. She thinks about how much of their relationship has been built on her willingness to extend that trust. How many small inconsistencies she'd let dissolve into the background because the alternative was a reckoning she hadn't wanted. She thinks about Simone, not with fury, not yet, with the specific, clarifying feeling of something finally becoming legible. Because here's what Nadia understands, now that she's paying the right kind of attention. Graham has never actually lied to her outright. Not once. What he's done is something more sophisticated than lying. He's offered her versions, plausible, adjacent to true versions, each one designed to give her just enough to stop asking, without ever giving her enough to actually know. It requires a particular kind of intelligence, and a particular kind of contempt. She's been a participant in her own management. That's the thing she can't unknow. The next 2 weeks, she moves through their life together the way she always has, present, warm, unremarkable. She watches him, not with suspicion visible on her face, she's too careful for that now, but with the quiet, methodical focus of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is simply gathering what she needs to be certain. Graham, for his part, is beginning to get comfortable again. This is the mistake people like him always make. They take the absence of an explosion as evidence that there is nothing to explode. They read stillness as safety. They see a woman who hasn't pushed and decide she isn't going to. And then, slowly, the way arrogance always metabolizes into carelessness, they start to slip. He starts taking longer in the bathroom with his phone, starts going to bed after her instead of with her, comes home from a Thursday meeting she knows ended at 5 and walks in at 8:15 with a story about drinks with a client that he delivers with just a fraction too much detail. The engineer's brain, tidying as it goes. She lets him talk. She nods at the right moments. She asks 1 or 2 questions, the right ones, not too many, and watches him relax into the interrogation, the way someone does when they believe they're winning. He doesn't know she already spoke to Marcus. She hadn't planned to. It happened at a neighborhood thing, the kind of accidental proximity that feels afterwards like it was arranged. Marcus had always been kind to her, careful in a way she'd noticed but hadn't interrogated. She understands his carefulness now. He knew something. He didn't know what to do with it. She doesn't ask him to confirm anything specific. She just says, quietly, that she's been trying to piece together the timeline of that night in October, and she wonders if he remembers what time Graham left the office. Marcus is quiet for a moment. Then he says, gently, that Graham hadn't been in the office that day at all. Not late, not stuck in traffic, not at a client dinner, not in the building. Before we get to what Nadia does with that, tell me something. Have you ever been handed an explanation that felt just slightly too smooth? Something that fit, but only if you didn't push? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. She thanks Marcus. She gets herself a drink. She stands at the edge of the room and watches Graham across it, laughing, easy, working the space the way he always does. And she feels something settle in her chest. Not peace, not relief. Certainty. The story he told her that night was never about a client. It was never about traffic or a dead phone or bad timing. It was about buying himself enough space to do something he'd already decided to do and return to her afterwards as though he hadn't. While she sat in a hospital room alone and held the worst news she'd ever received, he came home. He held her. He said the right things. And all of it, every word, every held breath, every right thing, was a performance delivered by someone who had spent the afternoon somewhere else. With someone else. The question now isn't whether she's right. She's right. The question is what a woman does when she understands fully that she's been living inside someone else's carefully managed story, and she's the only one who never got to read the whole thing. Nadia decides to tell him she knows on a Saturday. Not because Saturday is significant, because it's the first morning in 3 weeks that she wakes up and feels completely ready. No residual doubt, no remaining questions she needs answered, just a clean, quiet sense of today. Graham is making breakfast when she comes downstairs. He's in a good mood. She can tell by the way he moves around the kitchen, unhurried, humming something tuneless under his breath. Biscuit is at his feet. The coffee is already on. It looks, from the doorway, exactly like the life she thought she had. She sits down at the table and watches him for a moment. He turns, sees her, smiles, asks if she slept well. She says she needs to ask him something, and she needs him to answer her honestly, just once. She's not going to argue. She's not going to perform anything. She just wants the truth, and then they can both decide what to do with it. He sets down the spatula. His face does something careful. She asks him about Simone. Not the phone preview, not Marcus. She doesn't show her hand all at once. She's been paying attention long enough to know that if she lays everything out, he'll shape himself around it. So she asks about Simone, and she watches what he does with the question. What he does is exhale, very slowly. And for a moment, just a moment, something crosses his face that isn't the version of Graham she's used to. Something tired. Something close to relief almost. The way people look when they've been holding weight for too long and someone has finally offered to set it down. Then he puts the version back on. She's a colleague, he says again. They work together. There's nothing to worry about. Nadia nods. She tells him she spoke to Marcus. The version drops completely this time. He doesn't say anything for a moment that stretches out longer than it should. Biscuit looks up from the floor, sensing something in the room that has shifted. Graham sets both hands flat on the counter, and Nadia watches him make the calculation she has been waiting for him to make. The one where he decides how much of the truth is now unavoidable. He starts with an apology. This is typical, she'll think later. Lead with contrition. Buy yourself sympathy. Make the person across from you feel like receiving the confession is the important thing, rather than the content of it. He's sorry. He should have been honest. It got complicated. She lets him talk. The outline he gives her is not the whole picture. She knows this, the same way she knows everything now. But it's enough. Simone is not from the Edinburgh office. Simone is from his running group. They have been, in his careful language, close for approximately 11 months. It started as nothing. It became something. He had ended it. This said with emphasis, like it's the most important data point, 2 months ago. It's over. He should have told her. He's sorry. 11 months. She does the arithmetic again. the way she's been doing it for weeks. 11 months takes them back to January of last year, the year they'd started trying for a baby, the year she'd been charting and hoping and letting herself believe they were building something together. He was 11 months into something else. The night she miscarried, he wasn't working late, and he wasn't in traffic, and he wasn't at a client dinner. He was with Simone. He came home. He held her. He said the right things. And in the morning, he went back to his life, both of them, and she went back to hers, one of them, and she hadn't known there was a difference. She asks him, very quietly, why he's telling her it's over like that's the variable that matters. He doesn't seem to understand the question. She asks him if he understands what it means, what it actually means, that he was with someone else the night she was alone in that room. Not just the betrayal of it, the specific shape of it. That she had held herself together in a hospital and driven herself home and waited for him because she had trusted that he was exactly where he said he was. And he had walked through the door and held her while being, in every meaningful sense, somewhere else. He says he knows. He says he's sorry. He says he has no excuse. He is correct on all 3 counts. But sorry, Nadia has come to understand, is not the same thing as comprehending the weight of what you've done. And Graham, for all his intelligence, for all his careful versions and smooth delivery and practiced calm, Graham doesn't comprehend it. She can see it in his face. He thinks this is the hardest part. He doesn't know the hardest part is what she does next. She doesn't ask him to leave that day. This surprises her later. She'd assumed, in the abstract, in the way you imagine crisis before it arrives, that she'd know immediately what she wanted, that clarity would come with the truth, that the truth would be a door she could walk through cleanly. What she finds instead is that the truth is a room, and you have to stand in it for a while before you know where the walls are. So she moves through the rest of that Saturday with a strange and specific steadiness. Graham doesn't know what to do with her calm. She watches him watching her, waiting for tears or fury or the kind of collapse that would give him something to respond to. She gives him nothing. She makes lunch. She takes Biscuit for a long walk alone. She sits with herself in the quiet of the park and lets herself feel the full weight of it without performing anything for anyone. The grief is real. She doesn't minimize it, even here. 4 years, a pregnancy, a version of the future she'd been holding carefully in both hands, not knowing it had already been dropped. She thinks about that hospital room. She thinks about it the way you return to something you need to fully absorb, not to punish yourself, but because the truth of it deserves to be witnessed. She had been alone in the worst moment of her adult life. Not because circumstances made it unavoidable, because Graham had made a choice, and then come home and made another one, and then kept making them, version after version, for months. That is the thing she has to sit with, not the betrayal in the abstract, the specific, deliberate nature of it. When she gets back, he's on the sofa. He's been crying, she can tell. His eyes have that particular redness. He looks wrecked in a way she recognizes is genuine. Graham is not, she thinks, a person without feeling. He feels it. He just also made every choice he made while feeling it, which tells her something important about the hierarchy of what he values. He asks her what she's thinking. She tells him she's thinking about the versions. He doesn't follow her at first. She lays it out for him quietly in order. The working late, the traffic, the dead phone, the client dinner. She tells him she counted them, that she'd been paying attention since January, and that she'd known or suspected or been unable to fully unknow for longer than he's comfortable thinking about. She tells him she spoke to Marcus. She tells him she saw the name on the phone in February and said nothing and waited because she needed to understand the shape of it before she could decide what to do. His expression shifts as she talks. She watches the realization move across his face, that she hasn't been blindsided by this, that she's been inside it, seeing it, holding it. That the calm woman across from him has been calm not because she didn't know, but because she decided what knowing required of her before she was willing to move. He says he didn't know she'd been carrying all of that. She says she knows he didn't, and that's the point. She tells him, steadily, without cruelty, because she's not interested in cruelty, that a person who loved her the way he said he did would have been paying enough attention to notice. That she'd been watching him for months, and he'd never once looked back the same way. That the version of Graham who managed her with smooth stories and just enough truth to keep her from asking the next question was not a person who had loved her carelessly. He was a person who had assessed her, consistently, and decided she was manageable. And she is done being managed. He starts to say something. She lets him. It's a good speech, actually. She'll acknowledge that even now. Remorse, accountability, love that he insists is real, a future he wants to try to rebuild. It's coherent and it's felt, and it's also, she understands, another version. Not a lie, but a version, shaped for the moment, aimed at a specific outcome. She used to walk through those doors without checking them first. She thanks him for saying it. She tells him she needs some time to think, and that she'd like him to stay somewhere else for a few days. Not forever, just long enough for her to be alone in their home and understand what she actually wants when nobody is watching her figure it out. He leaves that evening. He takes the dog. She asks him to because she can't have Biscuit looking at the door the way dogs do. She sits in the silence of the house. For the first time in 4 years, it's just hers. And for the first time in 4 years, that isn't the worst thing. Nadia doesn't go back. She wants to be honest about that, not because it makes her heroic, and not because it was simple, but because the story deserves an ending that's true. She spends 3 days alone in the house. She calls her sister on the second night and talks for 2 hours. She cries once, properly, on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub, and then she gets up and makes herself tea and sits at the kitchen table in the quiet and lets herself think without managing what she finds. What she finds is this. She is not destroyed. She thought she might be. She'd built so much of the last 4 years around this person, around the future they were constructing together, and she'd expected the loss of it to feel like collapse. It doesn't. It feels like setting something down that had been getting heavier for a long time without her fully registering the weight. She thinks about the woman who sat in that hospital room and held her own hand. That woman had been paying attention too. She'd noticed things, small, quiet, easy to dismiss things, and she'd chosen, over and over, to extend the benefit of the doubt because she loved someone, and love had taught her that extending grace was the right thing to do. She doesn't regret loving him. She doesn't regret the grace. What she understands now is the difference between extending grace and extending it past the point where you stopped extending it to yourself. She had been so careful with him. She deserves some of that care too. On the 4th day, she calls Graham and tells him she's made a decision. He is quiet on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of someone who already knows what's coming and is bracing for it with what dignity they have left. She tells him she doesn't want to reconstruct what they had, not because she can't imagine forgiving the betrayal, she's still figuring out what she thinks about forgiveness, but because she has spent months watching him, and she now knows something she can't unknow. She knows how he manages. She knows the specific architecture of how he builds a version of events and delivers it and monitors whether it's landed. She knows the angle he holds his phone. She knows the quality of his pauses. She knows what his face does when he's recalibrating. And she cannot unlive any of that. She cannot sit across from him at dinner and not be the woman who knows all of it. And he cannot look at her without knowing that she knows. That's not a marriage. That's a surveillance arrangement. She wishes him well. She means it. She hangs up. And then she sits in the house that is hers. That was always, in some sense she hadn't let herself claim, hers. And she breathes. Here's what I want to say about Nadia before we close this one out. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she finally started listening to the part of herself that had been trying to tell her something for a very long time. The part that logged the pauses, the part that noticed the phone angle, the part that stood in the kitchen in February with a name visible on a locked screen and quietly, without drama, understood. That part had been patient. It had waited for her to be ready. And when she was ready, it didn't rage. It didn't collapse. It just said, "Here is what is true. Now decide what you're going to do with it." She gets Biscuit back on a Thursday. He rockets through the front door like he's been away for a year, spinning and skidding on the kitchen tiles. And Nadia sits down on the floor and lets him climb all over her and laughs. Actually laughs, for the first time in what feels like months. It's not fixed. Nothing is fixed yet. There are practicalities ahead of her, the kind that require lawyers and logistics and conversations she doesn't want to have. But she is sitting on her kitchen floor laughing at her ridiculous dog, and she is entirely herself, and nobody in this house is managing her. That's not nothing. That's in fact almost everything. If this story stayed with you, and I think it did, there's one waiting for you right now about a woman who said nothing for 6 years, and then said one sentence that changed everything. It's linked at the end of this video. I think you're going to want to hear it. I'm Dee. This has been lovely. See you by the firelight.